Well, good morning. I'm MassTLC CEO Tom Hopcroft. I'd like to welcome you to our series on mental health. Today's session is on supporting employees during times of insecurity. Over the past 4 weeks, MassTLC and MindWise Innovations have teamed up to offer this series about mental health in the workplace, specifically for tech. We've covered the stigma of talking about mental health in the workplace, how anxiety impacts teams, and the value of having a neurodiverse team. Today's topic will focus on how company leaders can help their employees in times of uncertainty and job security. As we get started though, I'd like to thank our global sponsors. These are the companies that help provide their time and treasure and thought leadership throughout the year to support all the work that we do, and we're grateful for their support. This is the 4th episode in a series on mental health. For those who have missed the prior sessions, you can find them online at masstlc.org. Also, MindWise Innovations has put together an amazing offer for MassTLC members to receive a free consultation. Lisa Desai from MindWise will tell you more about that in just a moment. For now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Erin Lurch from MindWise to review a few housekeeping items, introduce our guests, and get into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Lurch. I'm part of the MindWise Innovations team. MindWise provides a suite of digital solutions and consultative services that allow corporations, states, and universities to understand the unique behavioral health needs of their organization. MindWise is powered by Riverside Community Care, a nonprofit leader in behavioral health and human services. As Tom already mentioned, today's webinar is the last in a 4-part series on behavioral health and tech companies. We've come together to provide this series to help tech executives better navigate the psychological safety and anti-stigma requirements in today's workplace. Before we get started, I just want to go through a couple quick housekeeping items. Today's webinar is going to be about 60 minutes long. Please feel free to submit questions at any time via the Q&A function that's located on the bottom of your Zoom window. Please note that your submitted questions may be seen by other attendees with your name attached. If you'd prefer to ask your question anonymously, that option is available in the Q&A box. Your audio and video have been automatically disabled for this webinar, so there's no need to worry about being heard or seen during the presentation. There are a couple of points today where we may ask folks to unmute for a more informal discussion, but not to worry, there's no pressure and we will always ask you first. After the webinar is over today, there'll be a link available to view the recording for everyone who registered for today's. And you should feel free to share that link with others who may be interested. Now I'm excited to introduce our 2 presenters for today. First up is Lisa Desai. Lisa is the Director of Behavioral Health Consulting here at MindWise. She leads the development of new screening tools and innovative programs with the goal of reaching underserved populations. She's been a practicing licensed psychologist for 25 years, providing behavioral health services to youth, adults, and families. And also joining us today is Brian Cole. Brian is a 20-year technology professional who's spent his career working with startups and large organizations such as Bose Corporation and Dell Technologies. Now, as the Senior Vice President of MindWise Innovations, he leads all strategic and organizational development efforts, prioritizing the innovation of educational technologies and the digital transformation of all behavioral health programs. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Lisa to kick us off.
Erin, thank you.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you. Very excited to be here today to touch upon a variety of topics. As you know, this is the 4th in a series. And today we want to focus on how to manage and lead during times of uncertainty in a variety of ways. And how can we have conversations such as job insecurity as well as other difficult conversations during this time. We'll touch upon not only what works in the current atmosphere and climate, but also emerging trends in leadership, building psychological safety, and why focusing on behavioral health in the workforce is more important now than ever. Brian, I believe we're going to begin with a poll.
Before we do that though, hey guys, this is the fourth in our series. This is the final in that series of 4. Tom, we want to thank MassTLC. You guys have demonstrated a level of courage. These are not easy conversations, particularly at this moment in time. So thank you very, very much for again, demonstrating that courage, bringing us in and allowing us to help facilitate these conversations.
Thank you, you, Brian and Lisa, and the folks at MindWise. This has been a great partnership. I look forward to it.
You guys are awesome. You know it. Thank you.
Yes, thanks to all of you.
All right. Polling question, first of the day. I think polls are going to open now. Thank you, Aaron. But quickly want to ask the question: how would you characterize your organization's response to the myriad crisis happening across the globe? And I think if we're not kidding ourselves, there's a lot going on right now. Lot going on. So we just want to get a quick pulse check. So give you a second to submit your response. Lisa, I'm curious, while we're waiting for that, how do you think that our organization has responded?
Riverside, yeah. I have a feeling you might ask that. I have to say, I would have to say it very positive, effective response. And I'm not just saying that, Brian, because you're on the call. I think that our CEO and co-founder, he has weekly communications that go out, weekly newsletters about how Riverside's responding. I think there's encouragement to speak up if there are concerns or questions. There's been a lot of flexibility regarding remote working for those that are able to, and we recognize that that's these days, quite frankly, a luxury to be able to work remotely when some are doing the staggered back to work. So I would say positive and effective.
Yeah, I agree. And then when I look across those that we provide services for, it is interesting to see the various levels of responses. So to that point, Aaron, what are we able to see the results? Yeah, good. Great. Now I think throughout the course of this morning, we'll try to deep dive into what do we mean by average, somewhat effective, what's making some of these responses positive and very effective. But really appreciate that quick pulse check for us.
Yeah.
All right.
So to review, what is the impact of this pandemic and the national unrest that we're experiencing? What's the impact on all of us? We know that since COVID began, anxiety has increased from mild to moderate levels at a rate of 25%. That's a study that's been done by the Kaiser Family Foundation. Something to keep in mind that even before the pandemic, the national rate among adults for ongoing anxiety was 30%. So important to think about the fact that this is not a new situation that many of us are experiencing. It is compounded by what's happening in these times. Related to that, 1 month into COVID-19, nearly half of working adults said that they had concerns about financial stress and financial insecurity, and that over a third would benefit from financial resources. So really important to keep that in mind. I found a finding that I thought was particularly interesting and kind of following up on our session we had with Andrew Chate talking about individual resilience, is when leaders of organizations were asked what they felt like might be the biggest barriers to company resilience, 33% said employee morale. So encourage you to kind of hold that thought as we have today's conversations, because what we're talking about in terms of psychological safety and optimal workplace environment is very much the underpinning of company morale.
I think we're Lisa, we throw around a lot of numbers, a lot of percentages.
Yep.
For me, the one that really spoke volumes is what we uncovered. It was the latter part of May into June, where 60% of organizations had yet to address COVID-19 across their workplace. Hence our polling question moments ago. So if we think about that for a minute, and Lisa and I work with organizations that have done an inferior job of addressing COVID-19, but 60% of organizations had yet to address COVID-19. So a lot of work cut out for us, a lot of work cut out for organizations. Lisa.
So, Brian, I do like to say, let's focus on what people are doing right. Statistics sometimes can feel very grim and overwhelming. So what are people doing? The top 100 companies that have lots of resources can provide a lot for organizations and employees. So let's look at what newer companies or smaller companies are doing, what their leaders are saying about what's helped them succeed, maybe even thrive in this climate. So as you can see by these quotes, themes like empathy, being connected, being aware that there's a sense of isolation as there's remote working and teams can't, even if they are coming to the office, can't have more than 2 or 3 people in a certain area. So how do you address that sense of isolation? And so communication, empathy, staying close to the values of what a company is built on in times of crisis. It's very easy, I think, for all of us to go into what can I just do to survive? And in the midst of that, being very clear about what do we stand for? What are the values of our company? And finally, how to build and maintain that sense of community, even as we work remotely, how to encourage teams to think differently, that outside of the box thinking. So while there's a scramble to problem solve and meet customer needs, production needs, also really important to think about how do we leverage each other's talents on teams in ways that maybe we haven't done before to really succeed. So Brian, my question to you, and those in the audience, please do use the Q&A boxes. What do these companies have in common, and how is that related to psychological safety?
Well, Lisa, funny. Thank you for asking. I think let's start with, and I know that we've talked about psychological safety throughout a couple of the sessions thus far, but let's just provide a quick high-level definition. We're Amy Edmondson fans. What can we say? But she really focuses on this idea of interpersonal risk-taking, or more specifically, candid conversations. What are organizations doing to ensure that everyone's voice is heard within that organization? Voicing concerns, voicing ideas, suggestions, etc. We all know that to be an imperative to drive our business, but we also know that it's easier said than done to facilitate, engender such a culture that allows for psychological safety. So when I see those quotes, and I hear, Lisa, you talk about empathy, again, we've known that to be the case for a while. When I hear you talk about thinking outside of the box, thinking creatively, Dan Tater, the CEO of ADK in session 1, talked about planning the business now, addressing the business now, and planning for the future. We've got to look closely at our culture, and we've got to determine in that culture, how does psychological safety show up, and make absolutely certain that it does moving forward. Lisa.
Yep. And I would add that I think as leadership, empathy sometimes can feel like a very soft skill. And so it's an easy to do skill. When in fact, really being an empathic leader and thinking about what's it like to be in their shoes is incredibly effective. And the piece that we often emphasize in working with organizations and leadership is it's also something that has to be done on a consistent basis. It's also modeling for team members that if leadership is doing this, let's think about how we can build this to our day-to-day interactions.
I'll tell you what, Lisa, the word that I think we've heard more in the last, 4 or 5 months for obvious reasons is vulnerability. And I think for maybe most of us in this session right now, we probably understand the role of vulnerability in the workplace, specifically through the lens of leadership, but that more than ever has to be demonstrated. You cannot have leadership without demonstrating vulnerability in this moment of time. So when a workforce, when a workplace looks up through the leadership ranks and sees those leaders demonstrating vulnerability, saying, hey, look, I'm just as confused as you are, that is one quick way to galvanize psychological safety. It's one lever, but don't underestimate the role of vulnerability and that just genuineness as a leader. Lisa?
So So in these times of uncertainty, and as we're thinking about, okay, so there is a psychologically safe environment, if you will. Many of you, a majority, I think all of you indicated that you were satisfied with how your company's been addressing COVID. So that speaks to the fact that there's something that's happening that's done well in your organization. So let's think about what individuals as well as what organizations and teams can do and leaders can do to bring a framework that is holding during these times. At Riverside, we've created a framework called Safety, Predictability, and Control. It's very straightforward. We refer to it as commonsensical, but it's an important tool to kind of hold on to during these times. So in terms of safety, we all know about physical safety, how to bring physical safety to our lives these days. It's almost become automatic, I would say. At an individual level, bringing that internal sense of safety is very much paying attention to what relationships, what conversations am I having in my private life, in my professional life that feel good, that feel sustaining, that feel energizing, and how can I have more of them? That's an internal sense of safety. Routine is very much, how do I build routine in my day-to-day, given that everything is upended? We were just talking before this call that it seems like now many of us feel like, okay, I've got a routine, I've got my summer routine, my kids have a routine, my spouse has a routine, and now we're looking to fall and schools opening, not opening, blended learning. How can you bring some degree of routine, again, shifting to meet those needs? And finally, control is very much about, there's so much we can't control in the world these days, in our country these days. What can you control? What choices can you make to have some degree of control? And in your personal life, what choices can you encourage your kids to make? Whether it's when to have their screen time, when to be outside, when to do their summer work. So very much at individual level, those are kind of ways to address that. And Brian, I know you've always had some great thoughts about how organizations can address SPC.
Sure. We even before we get to organization, we strongly encourage you to use this as a framework. We found great success within organizations. It helps them kind of frame up the conversations that need to happen throughout the organization. So we hope that you find value in this, you stick it in your back pocket, and you use it moving forward. From an organizational perspective, culture. And guys, we know this is all easier said than done, but we've got to look at our culture more now than ever before. When we talk about psychological safety, how serious are we taking that? We've been talking psychological safety for 10, 15, 20 years. In fact, it was Google that really put the stake, leave it to Google, right? It was Google that put the stake in the ground a couple of years ago with their project called Project Aristotle. If you haven't reviewed that study, it is quite fascinating. But they're the ones that said, look, in the end, we need an environment comprised of psychological safety. So look closely at the culture, recognize that cultures are meant to evolve. Secondly, in terms of predictability, communications. We have a client that every Friday afternoon, the CEO of a 10,000 person organization pulls together a web session and just puts himself out there and talks to the entire organization for those that are interested. He's been doing this since late March. So very predictable. We heard Dan Tater in session number 1 talk about ask Dan anything. Again, Dan not having all the answers, Dan demonstrating some vulnerability, but that predictable communication throughout the week, awfully important. And then thirdly, and guys, you have to forgive me. I don't know how many of you picked up on the game controller. I'm a bit of a geek, so forgive me, but game controller, safety, predictability, control. Anyway, this idea of empowerment. Look, again, we've been talking about empowerment for a long time, but as we'll discuss moving forward, that's awfully important from a control perspective. People want to feel like they can control elements of their job. We've got to empower. We've got to make certain that those high-performing teams are built and they're doing what they can do. They feel involved. They feel empowered. So safety, predictability, control, it works as well for an individual. It works as well for a family. as it does for an organization, as it does for a team.
And trust.
Here we are. Here comes this idea of trust. What can we say that hasn't been said about trust, Lisa? We've been talking trust for a long time.
I think that what comes to mind, a few things. Firstly, seems to be a different level of trust when you're working remotely.
Sure.
There's so much trust around, so I heard an interview, about 4 months ago on NPR, of course, about companies that aren't doing a good job about engendering trust in employees. And when the shift to the remote workplace happened, one of the things that was happening is employers were tracking keystrokes, things like that, in terms of, are people actually working from home? Are they working during those hours they're supposed to be working? And what happened is it eroded a sense of commitment to the organization, a sense of motivation, morale, and it actually led to employees leaving their jobs. So that's more of a dramatic example of what happens when there isn't trust in an organization. So again, we think of trust as, of course we should have trust. And I know you have referred to the trust tax, which was new to me. And, but a very interesting concept.
Yeah, it's always great to see Dell EMC as a sponsor. Tom, good for you, good for MassTLC. As a former Dell EMCer, and I can't say enough about that organization. And I don't know, maybe some of you are with Dell EMC out there, and if you are, hello. But I remember some of the work we did at Dell was around exactly, Lisa, this idea of a trust tax versus a trust dividend, and just how quantitatively and qualitatively you could measure elements of trust throughout an organization. It was quite fascinating. That was a few years ago. I do think that what it helps highlight is the level of comfort or discomfort managers, leaders have in having certain conversations. When I see a statistic like this, 69% of managers say they're not comfortable having certain conversations. For me, that's a clear indication that it's that there isn't trust in the system. That concerns me. Lisa, I'm sorry.
Sorry about that, Brian.
No.
It also makes me wonder that statistic about what rules have been in place over the years, over the last 50, 60 years in organizations and management and leading that discourages having certain conversations. So maybe those rules are getting in the way of comfort of managers talking with their team. That
reminds me, I can remember, this was a while ago, but I can remember, going through manager training and being taught in manager training that, hey, when these conversations come up, you slide the EAP business card across the desk. Remember that, sliding that EAP business card across the desk and referring them to the EAP. And that's certainly not to take away from the value of an EAP, but a missed opportunity to have some conversation with that individual around what it is he or she's experiencing, which we, if anything is changing, and the role, Lisa, you and I play, if anything's changing, it's how to have those conversations. So instead of just deferring them or referring them to an EAP, what kinds of conversations can we have with that individual? But anyway.
Yep.
Great. So, Aaron, here is an example of a question that we were hoping to maybe hear from some of you. How does an organization build psychological safety? And maybe you don't call it psychological safety. One of our clients refers to it as active caring. But how have you, or how does an organization foster psychological safety? We would love to hear from you on that.
Yeah.
Anyone?
Feel free to, if you'd like to just speak out loud, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Or if you'd rather write in the chat, in the Q&A box, that's also fine. I can read it out.
Thank you, Erin. And while we're waiting for those comments, I think what's especially interesting about psychological safety is while the concept remains the same regardless of sector, there are unique things happening within the tech space that really foster psychological safety. So curious if any of you have any reflections on that, specifically as it pertains to the tech sector.
And related to this question, given that, again, in the poll, many of you indicated that you felt your company was doing a good job of addressing the current crisis, curious about examples of what your company is doing that makes you feel good about that.
Yeah, you know, back to Dan from session 1, you know, ask Dan anything. You know, just a really kind of a great way of having that predictability, that safety.
So we may be having more of a listening.
That's okay.
Group.
Hey, that's all right.
Fine. Absolutely.
That's right. It's that I just get sick of my own voice. So sometimes it's nice hearing other voices, but I think, you know, to this question, Lisa and you and I have talked about this before, but specifically within, say, the tech space, I was always impressed with, you know, agile methodology, Scrum teams. Let's just take a Scrum team, for example. And when we think about a Scrum Master and the role that Scrum Master has on that Scrum team, you know, when you think about really the dynamic that's happening within a high-performing, a really effective Scrum team, is they're not going to be successful unless there's some sense of psychological safety, the accountability, the transparency, the candor, the radical candor, if you will. That's what makes that team successful. So take all the tech out of it, distill down to really what are the behaviors that are kind of fostering that psych safety, and it's transparency and accountability, everything we just said. So I'm particularly interested in how agile Scrum teams are structured, high-performing teams, autonomous teams, self-managed autonomous teams. These are great ways to spin up to help model, if you will, psychological safety for the rest of the organization. Lisa, anything to add to that?
Well, it's interesting to hear you describe it that way because I think when I think of Scrum teams, I think of efficiency. I think of just kind of a well-oiled machine, and the way you're describing it, I think is a reminder of the relationships that are inherent in that team that build the efficiency. So it's not simply the expertise and the capability of each member and the Scrum leader, but it's what are those qualities of transparency, being open to feedback, that really drive the success.
And as Amy Edmondson, who's really coined the expression, says, in the end, it's what are you doing to ensure the right conversations are happening? What are you doing to ensure that candor exists? So I don't know, just an example, at least from my past, around how we used Scrum teams to really foster psychological safety, or call it whatever you want.
Right.
Lisa.
So collaboration, so psychological safety naturally is going to encourage collaboration. And one of the aspects, you know, I think that Brian and I often talk about the fact that there's certain words that we use so much, like trust, that become almost buzzwords. So it's important to kind of really think about what does trust mean. In the same way, collaboration, diversity, it's important to look at what do we really mean by these terms. And Amit Mukherjee has a great book, Leading in the Digital Age, which Brian mentioned to me and was a fantastic recommendation. And, you know, a point he makes that I just love is that any leadership expertise or training isn't really going to be effective unless you pay attention to the identity, he often talks about paying attention to words. The words you use, the words matter, and identity matters. And really important to think about then identity and diversity in the traditional ways that we think about them, gender, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, all of that. Also to think about expanding it to diversity between organizations that you're working with, and also satellites of your own organization, if it's multinational, because the climate, the cultural climate of the team or a satellite in Asia and South America, that culture is going to be very different than the culture you're operating in. So how do you effectively collaborate across those cultures and not make assumptions? And finally, functional diversity kind of reminds me of what you're saying in terms of Scrum teams, Brian. How do you really respect the diverse abilities and talents within teams, and really encourage collaboration and learning from one another?
Wow, I maybe Lisa, we should have had Dan in this session, because I feel like we're referencing so much of what he said in session 1. But yet another thing he talked about was a culture of involvement. I think is quite fascinating, and something that Lisa, you and I spend a lot of time talking about at MindWise. But this culture of involvement gets to functional diversity. What do I mean by that? When we think about a Scrum team, when we think about a high-performing team, we know that every single individual on that team has each other's backs. We know that every single individual respects each other and know what those individuals bring to the table. So this culture of involvement, making sure that voices are heard, making sure that everyone is contributing. And as we'll say in just a few minutes, what does that involvement look like? And what role does our workforce play in even crafting strategy? So when we really think workforce of the future, how are we pulling on the workforce to help inform strategy moving forward? Radical for some, but anyway, great slide here, Lisa. Maybe I just maybe to echo what you said moments ago. I think I'm sensitive to this because we have used these words for a long time. We have used empowerment for a long time. Excuse me. We've talked about collaboration for a long time, trust for a long time, and to a certain extent, even psychological safety for a long time. I think what we're doing is challenging ourselves and challenging those we work with on recognizing how those words have evolved even in the last 5 months. What does trust mean today compared to what it meant 6 months ago? What does collaboration mean today compared to what it meant 6 months ago? And I think when you really kind of deconstruct those definitions, we continuously land on, wow, collaboration today does look, feel, sound different than it was 6 months ago. And in some cases, it's producing greater benefits today than it did 6 months ago. Maybe some wishful thinking, maybe it's a little too silver lining, but challenge each and every one of us to recognize how these terms are evolving, considering what it is we're experiencing. Lisa, anything to add on that?
Yeah. Well, Brian, I always have something to add. Well, what I would, it's something we haven't touched upon regarding psychological safety is being able to take risks, realistic, but take risks in trying new things at work, within a team, making decisions, and also feeling okay saying, I screwed up, I made a mistake, I did that wrong, or I need help with this. I need more information. I can't find that information. I'm going to Erin probably every day to ask for something, some kind of help. But I think working in an atmosphere where it feels okay to say, not quite sure how to do this, made a mistake, or I want to try something new, and getting support around that is invaluable.
Wow, Lisa, between you and me, I don't know what we would do without Erin.
Oh, I'm telling you.
All right, so company culture, since company culture has to allow for difficult conversations, how do you operationalize? Okay, so how dare us attempt to operationalize psychological safety. You know, this is where the conversation always ends with our clients. Okay, so this is great. We love this in concept. How do we operationalize this? How do we make this real? And I always go back to safety, predictability, and control. Look at the culture, deconstruct the culture. What's working? What's getting in the way? Predictability. How are you communicating? How are you showing up? How are you messaging? What words are you using? Many of you probably do morning huddles, or Tom, you were talking about your water cooler meeting this morning. Use those moments as an opportunity to check in with the team, demonstrate vulnerability. That's very predictable. The huddles, the after actions, whatever your structure is, use those as opportunities to establish greater predictability, but also ensure that effective communication is happening. And then, of course, on the control side, look at those teams. Use those teams as modeled behaviors for the rest of the organization. Be it a Scrum team, Agile team, whatever it might be, high-performing team, however you characterize your teams. Lisa, anything to add?
Yeah, just that you use the word modeling, and I was thinking to myself, when leadership does that, or managers do that, or team leaders do that, you're modeling behavior that then feels okay by team members to kind of replicate. So there's a lot of power in that, and there's a lot to be said about learning from one another, and leaders learning from team members who may have some natural abilities in relating, or in empathizing, or in checking in with people. So the learning doesn't have to be one directional. It doesn't have to be teams learning from leaders, but leaders can very much learn from team members. Yeah.
I think that's almost a great segue to the way forward. If I could just direct your attention to Chetan's quote here. We alluded to this earlier, and I think that this is, I've always debated, always wondered, you know, what the role of a manager was going to be 3, 5, 10, 15 years from now. Because I think what we're recognizing, certainly what our clients are recognizing over the last 6 months, is that if those doing the work, if those within the organization aren't involved in some way, shape, or form in those strategic discussions, that strategic direction, not feeling as if they're in the know, that in a sense is a part of the culture that's inhibiting and getting in the way. So I don't give this some thought. I'm again, something that we talk an awful lot about at MindWise with our clients is, how do we involve the workforce? How do we involve those teams in those strategic discussions? Lisa.
Sure. I wanted to also pause because, Erin, it may be that a question has come in for the Q&A.
Yes. So it's a little bit, I think it came in a few minutes ago, so it's not quite on topic for this particular slide, but the question was, my employees are concerned about our financial viability and suspect we may need to furlough staff. How do I talk about the subject of potential layoffs when I don't know who it will impact at this time?
Great question. Great question. Brian, do you want to start with thoughts?
We start by, this is a question we get asked often. It's a question that even we at Riverside have asked of even our own CEO. And all we can say is that radical candor, that transparency, and not having all the details is fine. Just saying to the organization, here's where we are. We've done this. We've communicated in a predictable fashion. We've been as honest as we possibly can. And I know, easier said than done, but think back to predictability. What the team, what the workplace, what our employees want is to know that every Wednesday, we're going to get an update. Every Friday afternoon, our CEO is going to stand in front of us and give us that update. It's predictable. It's predictable, and that in and of itself will alleviate some stress, some anxiety. Now more than ever, we've got to be frank. We've got to be candid, because our employees know. They know they know that most of us, many of us are struggling. So, I hope that's helpful, predictable, and just candid, transparent. And, as we've seen from our clients, those that are doing that, look, furloughs are not easy, layoffs are not easy, but they've come to recognize that it was the right thing to do. And it really, in some cases, helped foster a new burgeoning culture. Lisa.
Yeah, this reminds me, not through MassTech here, but in another series of webinars, we had a financial consultant actually talk about financial insecurity. And one of the points he made is to really encourage folks I think there's different level of stress around this based on how comfortable a person feels in terms of their preparation, if there's a change in a job or if there's a shift, and to really encourage people to become literate in a sense about their own organization around that. So I don't know if that's a bit oblique, but really if there is an individual that approaches you about their concerns, to hear that, as Brian is saying, absolutely being upfront and sharing the information that you have. And I think it creates, understandably, anxiety. So also to guide folks to resources. I mean, I would say you have to think about that as also an option. If they're really concerned, what supports could they have in place to address the feelings they're having and the impact?
The other thing that we have done historically is we've reserved the financials for the financial team. We've reserved the financials for the leadership team. We've reserved the financials for our stakeholders. We've reserved our financials for stockholders, instead of ensuring that those financials, ultimately that financial acumen trickles down throughout the organization. Again, easier said than done. But the sooner we're able to have those conversations, high level, but the sooner we're able to have those conversations, balance sheet type conversations across the entire organization, the sooner we're able to, again, provide a level of transparency that maybe we've never provided. It's why I'm adamant, that the entire organization be aware of where we are month to month. What are our financials? Whether you understand how to read a balance sheet or not, at least you're gaining some exposure, ultimately developing some acumen. Lisa.
I have to smile because I indeed have learned more than I thought I would about spreadsheets and budgets. And this may embarrass Brian, but he really does walk the walk in terms of, every member of our team, regardless of role, has a sense of where we are in financials, what our goals are, what we need to do, where we've made really good progress, where we're not quite making the progress we need to, and collaboratively thinking about how can we get there. So, it's a good lead in to what are emerging leadership qualities. Collaboration, as I touched upon before, is key, not only within your organization or team, but also between organization, maybe even competitors, maybe folks that you really respect what they're doing at their organization and their teams, and how can we work together? How can we maybe even problem solve? Valuing a breadth of knowledge by leadership. So yeah, it's always great and of course important for leadership to have specific areas of expertise, be it finance, be it operations, be it a certain topic in technology. But that breadth of knowledge is becoming much more in the forefront. Again, something I've learned a lot about from Brian is that he tends to ask, help me understand this. From Brian's background in technology, workforce development, he's really now in an organization we work on mental health and suicide prevention. And so it's not unusual, Brian, for you to say, hey, help me understand the thinking around this approach to mental health, this approach to substance misuse. And I think that curiosity builds that breadth of knowledge and leadership.
Well, Lisa, geez, I thank you. I wasn't expecting that. I appreciate that. But yeah, me to the side, yes, absolutely. Empathy, curiosity. I do think that as we do what Chetan is suggesting, is make sure the organization, the entire organization, the workforce is involved somehow in those strategic discussions. It behooves leadership to have a better understanding of what's happening throughout. So we can call it flattening the organization, if you will, but that breadth of knowledge, awfully important.
And following up on that, leadership's participation in problem solving. So getting away from the idea that I'm going to bring it to this particular team member to solve that piece of the problem. If there is a problem and it feels like it's a challenging problem, bring it into leadership, and let's have a conversation about how to address that. And then related to that, creativity. How do we make space as a leader to bring creativity to a team so there's outside the box thinking? Speaking of outside the box thinking, as you can see, we are, as an organization, MindWise thinks a lot. It is our area of expertise to think about how do we provide behavioral health to communities, to workplaces, to schools. As you know, this is the last of our series. We'll very much miss working with John, Sarah, and their team. And again, really important to think about why is it really important to address mental health and substance misuse in the workforce? Yes, it's a nice thing to do. Yes, it's a good thing to do from a human perspective, but it's actually a business decision in the sense of, as Tom says every week when he's introduced this, people are really at the focus of the work. And if we're going to say that human capital, people are our most prized resource and possession, we have to make sure that we are not only physically healthy, but healthy from a mental health standpoint. So if we look at current needs, again, we know anxiety is high these days, depression, even suicide risk has increased in times of prolonged crisis like today, worries about family members, substance misuse, all of that is on the rise, in addition to stressors like back to work protocol, back to school protocol for our children. So these are needs to be addressed now. And thinking about what can you have in place as an organization to meet these needs is key. And then to look at what are anticipated needs that we know from our work, the impact of prolonged stress, the impact of financial stress on companies and individuals, and the need for the strategies to really be embedded within an organization and lead to real accurate information, managing strategies, managing anxiety, depression, training leaders to know how best to support employees when they have somebody coming into the office talking about this, on a Zoom call talking about this, how to take those right actions, access counseling, EAP services that most organizations have these days, and addressing substance misuse, which we know, again, is on the rise these days.
If we could think back to, and forgive me, Lisa, I think it was 69%. If we think back to something we discussed earlier, managers feeling uncomfortable to have certain conversations. If we could, we want to leave you with SPC, safety, predictability, control, a tool, stick it in your back pocket. But if there's something else that we want to strongly encourage, if you're not doing already, is make sure that your leadership team, your managers, your supervisors, whomever, are getting the experience, the training, and the practice to have these conversations. We do quite a bit of work in this space, and I can tell you that the vast majority of those we work with are not ready, not equipped. They don't have the language. They don't have the confidence, as we see in that statistic earlier, to have these conversations. So whether it's someone showing up to work feeling extraordinarily anxious, how does a manager have that conversation? Let's just please, we ask that you give that some consideration, again, if you haven't already.
And a reminder, as Tom mentioned in the introduction, that we are happy to provide a consultation if any of you or your organization wants to contact us. These days, the types of specific topics that we tend to be providing guidance and consultation on has to do with supporting remote and return to work teams, the staggering of teams, supporting family members during these times of crisis. So lots that we're happy to speak with you about. And you'll see our email information. We just a quick overview. I know those of you that have attended some of the other webinars have seen this. Our approach is very diverse, but and comprehensive. So we can provide discrete services. We have an online screening program, crisis response services, training, quite a bit, a program called Behavioral Health Literacy that, to Brian's point, encourages conversations, how to have safe messaging conversations, being respectful in discussions, and that transfers not only to behavioral health literacy, but lots of conversations that organizations are having these days. So Brian, there's so much that we offer. I hate to kind of.
No. I just, it's, for me, it's about you out there and just making sure that that you feel you have the tools, the resources to go and maybe continue these conversations within your workplaces. Maybe you're already having them. If so, good for you and congratulations. These aren't easy conversations. It's a difficult time in our history as a species, if you will. But don't underestimate the value of such a simple framework as safety, predictability, and control. So you can imagine there's a lot that falls under those three concepts. Again, for individual, for families, for organizations, for teams. And then finally, recognize that these are very different conversations, and please make sure that you're equipping your teams with the language and the confidence to have these conversations. I'm a silver lining guy. I'm an optimist. I will tell you that the data, the research, the data is beginning to demonstrate or suggest that things are only going to get rougher for organizations, for families in the next 6, 12, 18 months. So please do your best to get in front of as much of this as possible. Again, if you're not doing that already. So quick takeaways, and then we'll jump into a Q&A with a few minutes remaining, but we recognize that these conversations are not easy. But looking at the culture, safety, predictability, and control, looking at where does psychological safety show up? If it doesn't, what are we doing to bolster psychological safety is awfully important. And we know that that's based on trust. But what does trust look like today compared to 6 months ago? We've talked about what that workforce looks like, how it bolsters morale, emerging trends, digital age. Look, leaders, how we lead today is very different than how we led 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. No different than what we're experiencing now. And then providing resources, as we just said, whether it's frameworks like SPC, whether it's financial literacy, whether it's behavioral health literacy, make sure that your teams have access to those programs. Lisa, anything to add?
I think that's a good summary. I hope there are questions if anybody has, or comments even, if you'd like to share thoughts, reactions. So if those of you that may have registered, they'll be viewing this afterwards. If you have any questions, please do feel free to email Brian or myself. It really has been a pleasure to work on these webinars with MTLC, and really just as Brian said, it's remarkable and very courageous to bring these conversations to workplaces and companies and employees. These are conversations that need to happen on an ongoing basis. And what we hear a lot from organizations and leadership is that when these conversations start happening, there's a tremendous sense of relief and positive energy that comes out of that. And to Brian's point, I think we all know that challenging times will continue for a bit. And so the more we can do to prepare as individuals, as organizations, and as leaders for what's coming down the pike, the more prepared we'll be when there are other bumps in the road, whether they be large or small.
It's almost like, okay, again, silver lining, but it's almost like using this as a catalyst to look deep into your organizational culture. And, are your leaders being developed in a way that they'll need to be to move forward? So Lisa, you're awesome. You're always awesome. Thanks for the conversation today. And yeah, please reach out if you have any other questions or want to continue the conversation somehow.
Lisa and Brian, I want to also lend my thanks. These are such important issues, and they're so critical to, again, our most important asset, our people, even during the best of times. And as we all know, we're not in the best of times right now. So stress levels are a little bit higher. We're juggling a lot of things going on at work, at home, and school, and all this stuff. So, it's so important that we have resources like those that MindWise Innovations is able to provide. So I hope that a number of companies get really great value from these sessions, and I hope that a number of them also reach out and go a little bit deeper with their organizations and work with you guys, because it's just so important. So
yeah, that's great.
I want to thank you guys again for all that you've done to bring this important material to the tech community. This has been really great.
Thank you,
Tom.
so much, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. And you know what you just did? You brought me back to 7th grade. Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. These are the best of times. These are the worst of times. So what an interesting way to wrap up our series. But
That's
Tom,
right.
Thank you. You guys have been
That's right.
great. And we wish all of you out there health. Just wishing you the very best. And
Health and safety.
be in touch.
Hang in there. This too will pass. So
Yes.
Right.
You might need a little help along the way, and there are people here who can help. So thank you guys again.
Wonderful words to end on. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, guys.